Hi class. So for discussion week 4 on historical scholarship, I looked through the Oxford Scholarship Online database and was a little disappointed in the number of sources on Puerto Rico, so I chose a little broader of a topic. Today I'll be talking to you about the ideas of sovereignty and occupation in Latin America. The first source that I found on this topic was actually the conclusion of a book called The Invaded: How Latin Americans and Their Allies Fought and Ended U.S. Occupations, and this chapter was called Lessons of Occupation. It was the conclusion written by Alan McPherson. And in this chapter, he examines the view of the invaded and gives attention to the matters of political culture. He talks about the causal chain in all resistance movements, and he breaks it down into some pretty interesting tendencies where these resistance movements tend to emerge on the rural side of things, move to an urban landscape where it threatens the upper classes, and in this landscape you start to see some urban activists who will involve other countries and other individuals outside of the country. He goes on to argue that anti-occupationist points of view in the country do not necessarily mean nationalist points of view. They can actually be fighting more against the intrusions on their personal life or of local control more than they might be intervening on behalf of their own country. He goes through this chapter and examines the effectiveness of things like good public relations in the resistance movement and how they've utilized this to win people to their side. He goes on also to discuss the dangers of building up these institutions for a country and then relinquishing them within a withdrawal, and then falling into the hands of a potential dictator who comes in to fulfill this power vacuum. And he goes on to say that this can actually lead to disenchantment with democracy because these institutions that a democracy created were being used against the public, which was very intriguing. He also discusses the need for streamlined objectives when it comes to Washington and the boots on the actual ground, and he talks about how the State Department really needs to step up as the center of these occupations to facilitate the flow of these objectives to get them met. And he kind of ends his argument with this discussion of the memory of occupation being almost as important as the events that were experienced in occupation, because he talks about how this can affect that population for generations. He uses a fantastic array of sources, predominantly primary, like literature, art, inscriptions, oral histories, and data, and he mixes in a couple secondary sources as well, and he does this very artfully. The second source that I found was a chapter in Sovereign Debt Diplomacies, Rethinking Sovereign Debt from Colonial Empires to Hegemony. And the chapter was entitled Sovereignty and Debt in 19th Century Latin America, which is really setting the stage for what I plan on writing about. And this chapter was by Juan Flores and Felipe Ford Cole. In this chapter, they talk about how the debt of these countries led to the erosion of their sovereignty, and it really became a device for external control by other countries. And it's not just the United States doing this. He talks about how even though there may not have been as much military intervention in Latin America, it didn't mean that people weren't intervening. They just were doing it by different methods. He goes on to make the claim, they go on to make the claim, that sovereign debt played a key role in the formation of Latin American countries and in their relationship with other governments and the world economy. And all of these make valid points. He creates his argument by first reviewing the literature on the debates over informal empire and on this concept of dependency theory, and then he goes through and examines some examples of these debt disputes as causes of intervention, and he looks at the mechanisms that these other imperial countries use to control and to limit the sovereignty of these nations in Latin America. Then he goes on to survey the legal frameworks that were used to justify these actions, and he discusses and evaluates Latin Americans' perception that international law is the only way to prevent intervention. He uses primarily secondary sources, but they are from a great variety of Latin American countries. And here are my sources.